The European slave trade began earlier, in the 1400s, when the Portuguese transported African slaves to Portugal and then to Spain. By 1505, African slaves had begun to arrive in the Americas. Portugal, Spain, Holland, and then England became involved in this profitable but miserable business. Merchant captains would spend several months traveling along the African coast, making deals with Portuguese traders or African chieftains. Through armed force and kidnapping, men, women, and children were gathered and chained hand and foot. They were branded like animals and shoved into the stinking holds of ships. Shackles, branding iron. Slaves were often held at forts called barracoons to await the long ocean voyage. Crowded into these airless places for 5 to 10 weeks, the captives were hardly fed. Almost half of this human cargo would die before reaching the New World. The survivors were sick and weak and frightened. Their futures held nothing but misery. Sadly, slavery was a highly profitable business for the traders. High demand and profits would keep the slave trade alive for hundreds of years. In that time, at least 10 million Africans would be brought to the Americas as slaves. Leg irons. John Hawkins, Francis Drake. Around 1560, many seamen adventurers became actively involved in challenging the Spanish in the New World. Hawkins's cousin, Francis Drake, was the most famous of these adventurers. Drake hated the Spanish and longed for the day when England could freely sail anywhere in the world. He made 6 voyages to Spanish Main over 30 years, using elaborate and incredibly daring plans to raid Spanish ships and ports. Drake's success greatly embarrassed the Spanish, who were forced to give their ships and ports more protection. Drake's third voyage, 1577 to 80. Drake's third voyage, in 1577, was his most difficult and successful. To anger the Spanish and prove that English ships could sail where they pleased, he was determined to follow Magellan's route to the Pacific. Fierce storms and mutinous crews caused 4 of his ships to be scuttled or sent home. Only the Golden Hind sailed out into the Pacific and up the American west coast. Raiding Spanish ships along the way for treasure and supplies, Drake and his crew eventually sailed north to California and possibly to Oregon. Drake's third voyage, 1577 to 80. Leaving the California coast, Drake followed Magellan's route across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, rounding the tip of Africa and then sailing north for home. The Golden Hind reached England in September 1580. Drake and his crew had sailed for almost 3 years and had traveled 34,000 miles. Drake was hailed as a hero and honored by the English Queen, Elizabeth I. He had proved that Spain could be challenged for control of the seas. 8 years later, England would defeat the Spanish Armada, the strongest naval fleet on earth, and Spain's absolute power at sea would come to an end. While Drake was sailing Spanish waters, other Englishmen were continuing their quest for a northwest passage. Beginning in 1576, Martin Frobisher, Humphrey Gilbert, and John Davis all made voyages to North America. They explored the icy regions of what are now Greenland, Labrador, and Baffin Island. Although these explorers didn't discover a passage or find valuable minerals, they did contribute new information for future expeditions. Over time, Europeans came to fully appreciate the value of the natural resources, timber, furs, and fish. Soon they were eager to establish permanent footholds in the Americas, colonies with which they could trade.